Now, considering that introduction, I want to actually kind of break the fourth wall, if you will, and sort of peel back the curtain in terms of the rest of this demonstration environment that you'll see as you go through all the different courses in this learning path. For every other portion of this learning path, you're going to see a situation similar to what you're seeing here, where I've got a copy of Windows Server, and we'll be dealing with that copy of Windows Server, logging into it, authenticating to Active Directory, and so on. But before we get into that view of the world, I think it's important for us to take a look at the VMware Workstation backstage, if you will, so you can get a feel for exactly how you might go about creating those virtual machines if you're new to VMware Workstation. Let me actually, again, kind of break the fourth wall here and actually drag down so you can take a look at my copy of VMware Workstation. Again, as I said, this is the only time you'll get an opportunity to see what goes on behind the scenes in building these demonstrations. What I have here are a variety of different virtual machines, as you can see, most of which are off at this point, that are the different VMs we'll be working with as we go through all the different courses in this learning path. I've got this machine DC here that is powered on and currently attached to my Windows Server domain. In order to create a new virtual machine, I would go up here under File and New and create a new virtual machine of type Custom. I would create it as a Workstation 11. This is the version of VMware Workstation that I have presently. Choose Next, and then in our case here, attach it up to a copy of the Windows Server 2012 R2 ISO file. So this ISO file corresponds, actually this was the Windows 8.1 ISO file. I could then move down here to my Windows Server ISO file and then attach it up as I see fit. So down here, 2012 R2. If I choose Next, then I can identify what the product key would be, and for all the instances we'll be working with Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard. I could even enter in a full name here and then a password if I wanted to accelerate the process of installing Windows here onto this virtual machine. If I click the link down here to log in automatically, this will prevent you from having to go through the normal installation steps to get your VM up and operational. I'm going to choose Next here just because these are all optional additions when you create that VM. Note the error message here that if you don't enter a Windows product key, that Windows will install, but you need to manually activate it later. This is okay because we're not really interested in activating our copy of Microsoft Windows. We just want to get Windows installed so that we can work with it in this temporary demonstration environment. I'll choose OK, and this gives me the ability to configure the virtual machine name and the location where it would go, the firmware type for the VM, and then the number of processors, the amount of RAM, and then the disk configurations that we will set. Here for the number of processors, for all the different virtual machines you'll be working with for this learning path, it's probably okay for you to configure a single processor per VM. Just due to some of the ways in which VMware Workstation works, it's usually a good idea to just set a single CPU as opposed to multiple CPUs. Now if I choose Next, this can identify where we would choose the memory for each virtual machine. In every case, with the single exception of your Hyper-V server, all the VMs that I'll be using will have 2 gigabytes of attached RAM. That Hyper-V server might need just a little bit more because obviously it's going to be running different virtual machines, but for all the other VMs you'll be dealing with, 2 gigabytes of RAM is a good, at least bare minimum of attached RAM that you can configure. Now I say this because if you're not in that situation where you got a full 32 gigs on your hardware host, well, conserving down how much RAM you have on each VM will allow you to run more VMs simultaneously. That running of multiple VMs simultaneously is something you'll have to do in order to follow along with really quite a few of the different demonstrations we'll be going through here in this learning path. So set your VMs here for 2 gigs of RAM and configure them to use bridged networking. Configure them to use the LSI Logic SAS controller here, an IDE virtual disk type, and then to create a new virtual disk. Now because this is VMware Workstation, I can configure this maximum disk size to be really anything I want. I can pop it up here to 250 gigs, for example, if I wanted to, as long as I don't configure this checkbox here to allocate all the disk space now. If I check that box, the full 250 gigs of space is something that I'll have to have on the disk where that VM resides. And in order to conserve space, I'd rather use thin provisioning as opposed to thick provisioning for that virtual disk. So I'll leave this cleared to not allocate all that disk space now. I also find that storing the virtual disk as a single file just makes it easier to move them around should I need to. I'll choose Next here to configure this as the virtual disk for this sample machine, and then that's the virtual disk file name as well. If I choose Next then, and then Finish, that will create the new virtual machine. Once created, you can go through and edit any virtual machine settings that you see fit, perhaps removing floppy drives or USB controllers or printers off of this virtual machine. But really, that's just the configuration that I'll be using in creating all the different virtual machines we'll be working with throughout the courses here in this learning path. Now, there is a couple of other things that I want to show you that relate to VMware Workstation that can make your experience in working with it just a little bit easier. This virtual network editor is the location where we can go about configuring the different virtual networks that are associated here with VMware Workstation. Now, the virtual networks we have here, as you can see, are all host only. This is just the variety of specific networks built here into VMware Workstation. We also have the bridged network that we configured on that virtual machine just a second ago. We'll be making some adjustments to these virtual networks as we progress through the different courses that make up this learning path, and adding additional networks that support the needs for, most specifically, that remote access role. I'll show you the specific configurations you'll need to add into your virtual network editor as we get into that course. Now, for many of us, in addition to networking, actually having enough disk space is something that can be an expensive proposition when you think about just the different types of hard disks that can be required. Even with thin provisioning, we still have some very big disk files that VMware Workstation will require. Now, one of the things I'll tell you is that all the virtual machines that I'm running here are running on top of SSD disks. And that's because SSDs provide a significant improvement in performance anytime you're dealing with virtual machines on a desktop. The only downside is that SSDs can be expensive. And so compressing or reducing the amount of space that is required can prevent me from having to spend a lot of cash on a larger SSD disk. Now, one of the techniques that I use in order to reduce that amount of disk space is by using what are called linked clones here in VMware Workstation. These begin with the use of this Windows Server 2012 R2 U1 template, which is literally a copy of Windows Server 2012 R2 that I created and then powered down for the express purpose of then copying and creating what is called a linked clone. That process to create a linked clone starts by right-clicking here, and then under Manage to choose to clone this virtual machine. Now, in order to get this machine into a state where it can be cloned, there's a couple of steps you'll want to go through. These can be kind of advanced steps if you're not really comfortable with the process of using things like the sysprep command. I have actually run sysprep on this machine and powered the machine down prior to configuring here a single snapshot on that machine that I use for cloning. This snapshot here, if I take a look at the snapshot manager, is a single snapshot right here in this location that provides the source point for the creation of this linked clone. That snapshot we can come down here and then right-click again and back to Manage, use as the starting point, as I said, to create this new virtual machine right here. The use of snapshots and linked clones as snapshots right here provides a way for me to create multiple virtual machines, all of which have a single source, that being the template file itself. Doing so can greatly reduce the amount of storage space that each VM requires. Now, this is by no means necessary for you to do. You can create individual VMs as you see fit. But if you find yourself running a little short on disk space, this use of snapshots, this use of sysprep, and the use of cloning is a little technique you can use in order to reduce the amount of disk space that's required. Once you create that linked clone here, you can see you give it a new name and a new location. When you choose Finish, the creation of the new virtual machine happens extremely quickly. This is the case because the clone contains only those differences that exist between the VM that was created and from its source virtual disks. And so at this point, there's really no changes. So all we're doing is creating a couple of pointers that we'll later then use. Once I've created virtual machines, you can see here's the VM that was just created over here. If I drag this over, this virtual machine I can then power on by hitting the power on button right here. And then from that point, I can use the virtual machine just as if it were its own independent virtual machine and virtual hard disk. So if you see fit to actually follow along, you may actually want to go about creating at least some of these virtual machines to get yourself started. We'll be working with these as well as a few others as we go through the progression of all the different courses making up this learning path.